The Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast is back for another episode. Join Marc S. Ryan, a veteran health plan and health technology executive, as he explores the world of healthcare.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast. My name is Marc Ryan, and it's a pleasure to be hosting this podcast, and thanks to everyone who's listening. It's been several weeks now that we've had our music with intros and outros, as well as a couple of ads. So we will be taking two breaks again in this podcast, one to tell you a little bit about the Healthcare Labyrinth website, and the second to tell you about my book, The Healthcare Labyrinth. So today's podcast is all about PBM transparency. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of the information that I'll be talking on this podcast. Well, in terms of blogs, I had a blog at the blog tab of healthcarelabyrinth.com on December 14th that really talked about the issue of PBM price transparency, how drugs are priced, the PBM landscape, the rise of PBM transparency, and all the various players. And so I'll be taking some information out of that December 14th blog. Also, on March 25th, very recently of 2024, I sort of did a blog titled The Audacity of Mark Cuban. And it was meant in the best sense of that. And it tells you a little bit about some of the things that Mark Cuban believes we must do to really bring transparency in drug pricing to the fore. I talk a little bit about Cost Plus, which is one of his companies. I talked to you about some rebate barriers and things of that nature. So that's the other blog. So two blogs, December 14th, 2023, March 25th, 2024. In terms of podcasts, I did have a podcast on January 12th, 2024 that really talked about drug price negotiations in general. There's a little bit of overlap with this podcast where I talked about how drugs are priced and things like that. But that January 12th podcast really focused largely on the Inflation Reduction Act's Medicare drug price negotiations. So if you want to go back and listen to that as well. But there will be a little bit of duplication because I want to set this up right in terms of what is PBM transparency, what's unfolding, and perhaps the future out there as Mark Cuban has laid some of the initiatives out as well. So let's talk first about, let's just give you another review of really what the current status is and how prices are actually brought about in the drug pricing system. Again, a bit of a repetition from the January 12th podcast, but I think it's important to talk about it here as well. So it's critical really to recognize that PBMs alone do not set prices for drugs in American healthcare. We have a tremendously opaque drug supply channel that begins with drug makers. And this is really how, in the simplest sense, although it's going to come off very complicated, that drugs are priced. There's a number of different players that essentially each are taking their share of profit out of the system, which in and of itself drives price as well. So the largest costs clearly come from brand drug makers or brand drugs. These drug makers have the near unilateral ability to set what I will call the gross price. After that, they engage in various grand bargains with other drug channel players to arrive at what net prices are. And there may be service fees, rebates, and other type of transactions that go from that gross to that net price. The most important discussions with brand drug makers occur with PBMs and health plans, or even employer groups, depending on what kind of line of business it is. And this is where a given brand drug will be placed on a drug formulary. Better placement on a employer group or PBM or health plans formulary or drug list will mean greater sales for the drug maker, and therefore the drug maker will offer better rebates that brings you from the gross to the net price of the drug. And those rebates are given by the drug maker, obviously, to the PBM health plan and the employer. Generic drugs follow a similar process in terms of pricing, but really without rebates. Generic drugs generally are placed on formularies for the most part. There are no rebates, but there are negotiations, obviously, between drug makers and plans as well. But the biggest cost of drugs out there are brand drugs, even though they represent a small share of overall drugs in general. And this rebate mechanism to go from gross to net pricing is the biggest thing. What's important to remember is that the rebates are really paid on a retroactive basis. So unless you really have a kind-hearted PBM health plan or employer, generally speaking, people at the point of sale are paying cost sharing based on the gross price as opposed to the net price. So that tends to drive up prices for the American public. As I say, that's not always the case. In some cases, cost sharing can be based on an estimated net price, but oftentimes Americans are paying at the point of sale based on the gross price of a brand drug rather than the net price because rebates are retroactive. Below the drug makers are a series of middlemen, principally wholesalers, who get their generous share of profit as well. So wholesalers acquire drugs from manufacturers, and there are numerous fees and transactions that can apply at this stage of the drug channel. Wholesalers then contract with pharmacies to supply those drugs. PBMs, along with rebate aggregators, contracts with health plans or self-insured employer groups to administer drug benefit plans, including claims, network, rebates, and quality oversight. And relationships between PBMs and health plans and employers historically have lacked a great deal of transparency too, with plans and employers complaining that PBMs are not really open about all the relationships that they have upstream and what the actual drug prices are. They're not very easily quantified, especially, again, given the retroactive rebate system and reconciliations that even happen with pharmacies. So those PBMs, along with the rebate aggregators, are contracting with the health plans or self-insured employee groups, and those relationships are not very transparent. PBMs then contract with pharmacies as sort of the network of record. These relationships are also very complex with both point-of-sale payments as well as retroactive adjustments or clawbacks to what is paid by the PBM down to pharmacies. There can be volume considerations and things like that that are taken into account. This, again, is pretty complex and controversial. Network and volume, again, can play a big part in payments to pharmacies. And pharmacies, again, often complain they often cannot tell what the final payment that they'll receive from a PBM for a drug transaction until months down the road because of all these clawbacks and retroactive adjustments that occur. So again, the poor consumer is sort of in the middle here. The consumer goes to a pharmacy to fill a brand drug and is paying, as I pointed out, cost sharing, usually based on the gross price in the case of a brand drug. And this, again, creates huge affordability issues. So this is an entirely opaque system that we have out there. Even players within the system don't quite know what the true cost of drugs are. And certainly a member who's trying to fill a drug or a patient trying to fill a drug really has no idea. And that creates great affordability issues. So in sum, the important point here is that with each transaction, there can be multiple payments or parameters that impact price. little of this, again, is understood or revealed to the public or even to the various participants in the process. Let's talk a little bit about the PBM landscape itself. Well, there are dozens of PBMs out there, some new, some old and legacy. But the fact of the matter is that three very large PBMs really control about 80% of the market. There is CVS, which controls over a third of the market, ESI, which is owned by Cigna, which controls about a quarter of the market, and Optum, which controls about over a fifth of the market. So these three guys add up to about 80%. Every other PBM out there, again, only amounts in total to about 20%. Humana's internal PBM, as well as Prime Therapeutics, which is another PBM, and MedImpact, round out the larger PBMs. Again, CVS, ESI, and Optum controlling about 80%. And then next in line is Humana's internal PBM, Prime Therapeutics, and MedImpact. And again, another 50 to 60 or so PBMs struggle to gain any really kind of market share out there. The truth is, given the overall power of the big three, any other entity really struggles to get the very best price with manufacturers and rates with pharmacies, given the big three's really substantial volume. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of drug price transparency and the rise of what we think of as the transparency movement in the PBM world. And so, again, it's come to relative prominence over the immense frustration with price and how opaque the drug system really is. As I alluded to earlier, health plans and employers have been exceedingly frustrated over the lack of transparency of PBM contracts. Health plans and employers argue that PBMs have not disclosed the actual drug costs, all the various fees, and the rebates that PBMs get from manufacturers, or even the real size of them, and the actual amounts paid to and recovered from pharmacies. Therefore, health plans and employers and their members are paying higher overall prices for drugs. And again, this has led to the rise of so-called transparent pricing and the transparency PBM movement. And the sort of cornerstone of this movement is where a net cost for each drug is known, and the PBM is simply charging an administrative fee. Now, again, this is very much in its infancy. The uptake appears largely in the employer group side, and again, it's slow but sure. And the old legacy world of rebates and the opaqueness continues to be the dominant way of purchasing drugs in the system. But nonetheless, there's a drive toward greater transparency in the world. Let's talk a little bit about who is driving this overall drug price transparency and the reforms and the creation of the transparent PBMs. Well, there's a number of stakeholders in all of this. I will say there are about 5 stakeholders, and we're going to go through them pretty quickly here. So number one, there are lawmakers and regulators. And so Capitol Hill in DC has made PBM reform one of its top focuses in the healthcare world. A reform bill is not yet passed due to all the problems that we've seen with keeping the government open on Capitol Hill. But nonetheless, there is significant movement of bills within Congress, and I would suspect that there will be some movement on PBM reform coming up. And so those PBM reform bills that are likely, I think, to pass this year could encompass various number of reforms, perhaps not all of these. But let me sort of just tell you a little bit about some of the reforms that have been proposed and could make it into a bill. Well, first, these PBM reform bills would ban spread pricing, where PBMs are charging payers more than they reimburse pharmacies for a given drug, and they essentially retain the difference. That doesn't seem quite fair, and that has led to a lot of contention in the industry. So that is, banning spread pricing is probably something that will make it into a bill when it does pass, perhaps later this year. Related to the above of banning spread pricing, a bill could also dictate how PBMs charge customers, including disclosures and 100% rebate and other discounts being passed through to a plan to get compensation more onto a fixed fee for PBMs. A bill could also prohibit clawbacks from pharmacies, which are very common in the PBM world. There should probably also be mandated reporting to encourage transparency. And there could also be various initiatives to promote biosimilars, given the huge price tags of these fairly expensive brand specialty drugs called biologics. There could also be a movement to have rebates applied at the point of sale. That's a little controversial. It clearly helps individuals with high drug spend, but it could also lead to increases in other areas of healthcare because health plans may steal a little bit those of retrospective rebates for margin, but they also sort of lower costs in other areas of healthcare. So that may or may not pass, but that's something that could pass. And then also reform of formulary tiering could also be something Capitol Hill looks like. So that's sort of just a quick look at what could pass. Again, a betting man would say that a ban on spread pricing, some sort of dictates about how PBMs contract, some transparency reporting, and biosimilar promotion will probably be at the top of any agenda as they are the least controversial out there. I would also note that CMS, the regulator for Medicare and Medicaid, as well as the exchanges, has proposed rules to increase reporting to encourage transparency, so that will likely occur as well. In addition, CMS has and will be scrutinizing how payments are made in government programs by payers to pharmacies, thus PBMs to pharmacies as well. State laws have been passed reforming PBM pricing as well in a number of states. So that's the first actor in all of this transparency movement, lawmakers and regulators. The second actor are traditional PBMs themselves. And why do I say they're an actor in this transparency movement? Well, frankly, they're a little bit being forced into it. I think the PBMs that are legacy and use these rebates and this opaque structure have concluded that reform is needed. And that's really all about their future and whether they're going to be around. And their conclusion has really come from the movement from government and regulatory scrutiny, as well as just general trends in the industry, along with the rise of these transparent PBMs and the pressure they put on the legacy PBMs. While change is slow among the legacy PBMs, PBMs are starting to introduce transparent models with health plans and employers. I think they're a little bit of an afterthought, but they are starting to become more and more prevalent with the legacy PBMs. In addition, the PBMs are responding to other criticism by adjusting formularies to make insulin and other high-cost drugs less expensive. They're capping copays and tiers. They're addressing some of the network pharmacy payment issues. Some of them are eliminating so-called spread pricing. And they're working to give patients the lowest drug costs possible through tools and technology. Some of them are even passing that lower cost sharing, taking into consideration retrospective rebates for brand drugs. Some doubt the sincerity of all of these efforts by the legacy PBMs and whether the models are truly transparent. Some analysts suggest transparency may come at some cost to health plans and employers as well. So they need to make sure that these models are truly transparent and saving them money. The third sort of stakeholder in this transparency movement are the upstart transparent PBMs themselves. These are the new PBMs that are emerging and working with health plans and employer groups on truly transparent models. Some of these entities include Capital RX, Smith RX, Sana RX, Navitus, and others. And right now they have very small market share and they're focused more on the employer market. But these PBMs could grow as faith in the model takes hold and the entities prove their wherewithal by serving customers. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the barriers these transparent PBMs face, but nonetheless, they are trying to make a huge go at it, and they even have created their own alternative PBM trade group that takes on the traditional PBM trade groups, and they endorse PBM reform on Capitol Hill. So that's an interesting lobbying development here. And again, I'm going to talk a little more about how these transparent PBMs are hobbled by rebates as well as the sheer dominance of the big three. In general, right now, the way the system is set up, even these transparent PBMs have to go to the big three and other rebate aggregators to obtain rebates and other discounts, because that's the dominant form of brand reimbursement right now, and they have to sort of play that game. That is, unless they can create a truly alternative model. This is clearly easier on the generic side and more problematic on the retail side because of the rebates. One of the next players is health plans and employer groups. Well, what's happening here is more and more sophisticated health plans and employer groups are demanding transparent pricing because all the problems they've had before with the legacy PBMs. And they're abandoning also the concept of full service PBMs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. A good example of this is the recent announcement by Blue Shield of California that is basically abandoning their traditional PBM relationship with CVS and devising a new pharmacy care model with various programs to reduce pharmacy costs and improve quality with various players. These include specialty drug management, which will stay with CVS, refined drug manufacturer negotiations, which will occur through another traditional PBM called Prime Therapeutics, claims payment through Abarca, which is a technology entity and PBM, and simple and transparent pricing that will occur through Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drugs and Amazon. And I'll talk a little more about this shortly. BSC believes all of these vendors are best in breed in their area, and they're really looking to break the opaqueness of the traditional model. It forecasts reducing costs overall by 10 to 15%. Some question the speed and complexity of the endeavor and whether there is enough alignment or incentives in the various buckets they've created with vendors to be successful. But you really have to applaud the move by BSC to sort of go down this road with their commercial business. And the last sort of area that I want to talk about in the transparency move is what I call the innovators and disruptors. And these aren't exactly the transparent PBMs, which in and of themselves are innovators and disruptors. But these innovator and disruptors really seek to disrupt the current PBM status quo. Again, these are not PBMs, but entities that have sought out better ways to break the traditional supply chain and go direct to consumer largely. For example, there is Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drug. I very much admire Mark Cuban for what he's trying to do in the transparency world for drugs. And Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drug is really taking on. We're going to, after the break, tell you a little more about his model. But he's been successful in directly acquiring generic drugs and allows consumers to access these drugs for a very modest cost. The direct and transparent model is successful. A few analyses say Cuban's process could save hundreds of millions, perhaps billions over time annually in Medicare as compared with traditional PBM arrangements. Cuban is now moving on to other areas that we'll talk about. He again is hobbled a bit by the rebates in the brand world, but he is making a huge impact on the world. There are other online pharmacies as well, such as Amazon Pharmacy, DRX Health, and OneFull that have similar models. And again, Cubans and these other models have great promise if they can go from generics and leap to other areas, especially to brand drugs. And in the end, I really feel like these trends from these players in the transparency movement could eventually bring a truly transparent model. But alone, it could dramatically reduce drug spend in healthcare as well and what people pay through cost sharing. And when we get back from the break, we're going to sort of tell you a little more about cost plus drugs, some of the barriers that the transparency movement faces, and then talk about what a path forward may actually be.
The Healthcare Labyrinth is no ordinary website. It features news and commentary from one of the nation's leading healthcare policy and technology experts. Marc Ryan combs the internet for the latest healthcare news and publishes a news feed each weekday with summations and Marc's insights. Twice a week, Marc publishes a blog to go deep into a current issue. And of course, Marc hosts a podcast each week to delve even further. All of this is available at healthcarelabyrinth.com. Visit each day for the latest happenings in healthcare. As well, learn more about Marc's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at the website. That's healthcarelabyrinth.com, your go-to source for healthcare news.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking just a little bit about the players in the drug price transparency area. And I promised to sort of go a little further into Mark Cuban's cost plus drug company model. As I said, it's really taken the nation by storm, and others are doing it as well. But Cuban seems to be the most successful right now, getting a great number of partnerships out there. And again, this is all about going direct to the manufacturer to obtain drugs and then to the consumer. And it proves that you can really make money and lower costs. He would argue that this is not really a new model in free enterprise, just that the anti-competition actors in the drug world never really wanted it. And I think he's very much right here. So a little more on cost plus drugs. So Cost Plus has gained over 2 million client consumers by offering a very clear and transparent purchase model for generic drugs right now to start. It's very easy to understand. And what really comes into the cost for Mark Cuban's Cost Plus drugs for a consumer? Well, there's number one, the drug's cost, which is transparently laid out, a percentage add-on for Cost Plus's admin and profit, a small pharmacy dispensing fee, and a small shipping fee. That's really about it, and it's all very well known. And I would argue that good Americans do not besmirch others for wanting to make a profit as long as the product is low cost or has value. And that is why his model is very much a success. Americans know exactly what they're getting: a clear and reasonable price, mail order convenience, and consistency. It's a bit like the Walmart price signs that you see in the Walmart superstore when you walk through it on a weekend, as an example. So let's talk a little bit about the fact that, again, Cuban is buying directly from generic manufacturers. Cost Plus Drugs actually acts as its own wholesaler for about 2,500 generics. This cuts out traditional wholesalers. It also cuts out PBMs to some degree and pharmacies, because CPD is actually its own pharmacy as well. And so this is pretty easy with generic drugs. CPD is now introducing biosimilars, which is a type of generic for expensive biologic drugs. So that will be very helpful and bring even more savings to consumers. It is also entering the manufacturing game, which is very interesting, in part to deal with drug shortages, which in my view, and the view of many, is caused in large measure by the opaque system we have that doesn't really create free market competition to not only innovate, but manufacture and sell. So where does Cuban and some of these other players like transparent PBMs, which have a slightly different model, where do they run into barriers? Well, Cubans and others' proposals face barriers on the brand drug side, where rebate relationships dominate the system again. These are arrangements to lower the list gross price, as I said, to a net price after a rebate, which are collected well after the drug transactions occur at the point of sale. The brand drug makers grant the discounts again for favorable placement on a PBM or health plan drug formulary or list, actually at the expense of other related brand drugs. They are excluded from the list, as well as sometimes even at the expense of covering lower cost generics, which is a real problem. Further complicating Cuban's effort is the fact that the big three PBMs, again, CVS's Caremark, Cigna's Express Scripts, and United's Optum Rx, control again about 80% of the PBM volume. So that's a big juggernaut to really break here. Cuban is trying to work with brand drug makers, but is facing hesitation from them due to both the drug makers and traditional PBMs' addiction to rebates, especially among the big three. Transparency PBMs, again, are facing some of the same issues, gaining traction. But Cuban is certainly right to try, and so are the transparency PBMs. While the forces in the drug supply channel say they have good intentions and want to reform, change always seems fleeting and often is forced upon drug makers and traditional PBMs by regulators or lawmakers that have bully pulpits. Here's a good example recently. Recently, after being forced to dramatically cut its insulin prices due to congressional pressure, thank you in part to Bernie Sanders here, Novo Nordisk, a foreign drug company, said it would stop selling a popular insulin in the US that it had just dropped the price of. It will continue to sell the insulin, though, in other developed countries. How is that possible? Has Novo abandoned morality in its business decision-making? It makes absolutely no sense. So again, I wonder if these traditional drug entities are truly into reforming the system or not. And so why would brand drug makers and PBMs change? In Cuban's world, there would be no rebates for brand drugs and things would operate much like generic pricing does. So again, why would brand drug makers and PBMs do this? They actually lose critical leverage in the process. In a perfect world, drug makers compete on the price and the quality or outcomes of their drugs. But drug makers have thrived well in a very dark world where they use rebate agreements, patents, lawsuits, marketing, acquisitions, secret agreements with other players, and a labyrinthian drug approval process to their benefit. They really have mastered living in the anti-competitive shadows that distort the system so well. Will they really be so willing to give it all up to compete honestly, especially when margins that they now have are huge and the absolute best in the healthcare world? At the same time, the massive consolidation of PBMs over the years has not created the incentive for the big three to reform either. Again, they're testing the waters of transparency arrangements, but I really believe they're a bit of an afterthought because the current system works well for these PBMs too. Yes, they have again introduced the transparency models, but these are again afterthoughts, and I don't think they're driving business principles. I guess there is some hope that forward-looking and innovative leaders at the big three, such as Karen Lynch at CVS Health, may actually committed to reforms. But again, it's hard to argue that the big three and a few others are going to want to reform when the system has been as good to them as it has been to the brand drug makers. But I think it's important to note that Cuban and similar parties are finding ways to chip away at the lack of transparency and bring direct-to-consumer further down the road for generics, biosimilars, and maybe even some brands. But where I really think we're going to see some major change is with the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act's Medicare drug price negotiations are going to really change brand drug pricing. This nemesis of big pharma, or maybe that's really President Biden, but nonetheless, this big nemesis actually could usher in the rapid change that Cuban is looking for on how brand drugs are actually priced. Pure and simple, the Biden law threatens the concept of rebates. And when we get back from our last break, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why I think that will happen.
Health plans and insurance are confusing. Our healthcare system is in dire need of reform. Health policy expert Marc Ryan tackles both issues in his book, The Healthcare Labyrinth. It is both a guide to navigating health plans and fixing American health insurance. Marc dives deep into how health plans and the American health insurance system operate. He then outlines a comprehensive reform agenda for the system as a whole, including pricing, emphasizing health and care management, and ensuring affordable access to health coverage and a private delivery model. Marc is a bit of an unconventional Republican in that he believes affordable access is the morally right thing to do, and that it is also fiscally prudent for our nation. Learn more about Marc's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at healthcarelabyrinth.com or search at leading bookseller websites. Available in print, ebook, and audiobook forms.
Welcome back from our last break here. And at the break, I told you that I was going to go a little more into how I think the Medicare drug price law will actually change the paradigm and perhaps usher things along in the transparency movement. Well, let me just recap again what's happening with the Medicare drug price negotiation law. So the first 10 drugs in Medicare are now being negotiated, and the negotiations will be the basis for pricing beginning 1/1/26. Under law, up to 60 drugs in the Part D retail drug world and Part B medical world can be negotiated over time. And I think that's very interesting and a great reform that we're seeing. If Biden has his way, the president has just proposed to expand the Medicare drug price law to cover up to 500 drugs over a decade. And so that would dramatically expand from 60 to 500. And that would really be a seismic change in the industry. But even so, even if we stuck with the 60, I believe that Medicare drug price negotiation could force down the price of certain drugs so dramatically that rebates as we know it will then dissipate. Not just on the drugs subject to negotiation, but the fallout could also create the drop in price and rebates going away of drugs that are in the same class or even in related classes of drugs that treat similar or the same disease states. It clearly will take some time if it's only 60 drugs, less time if it's 500 drugs, but it would create a world where we have something akin to a net price from the beginning for brand drugs. The drug price negotiations should be extended to the commercial world, I believe, as well. But the Medicare drug prices could move the commercial world to transparency even without that extension to the commercial world. All this is important in the brand world for forces like Cuban and the PBM transparent players to succeed. And because rebates are paid retrospectively, again, consumers sometimes get the short end of the stick because they're paying their cost sharing at the point of sale based on the gross price and not the net. This, again, causes great financial misery for those with multiple comorbidities and on a number of expensive medications. So again, I think the movement of Cuban and the transparent PBMs could actually be helped by the fallout of Medicare drug price negotiations. I would note that Mark Cuban has proposed some other changes at a recent White House forum on drug pricing. And here, Cuban indicated where he doesn't exactly use a PBM in his model, but he sort of endorsed transparency PBMs with this proposal. He said that state and federal programs should contract with smaller PBMs, presumably transparent ones, and adopt single formularies for Medicaid and have one PBM serving the Medicaid program in each state. Medicaid has fashioned a framework that has some of the elements that Cuban likes and what is practiced in other developed countries. The Medicaid rebate program collects retrospective rebates from brand drug makers from both fee-for-service and managed care lives. State and federal rebates joined together and are very major in terms of the discounts that they're able to leverage. Where states have set up single formularies and centralized approaches, formulary committees decide what should be on the formulary from a cost and clinical effectiveness approach. In effect, a net cost basis is arrived at universally in the state's programs. The retrospective nature does not matter as much because Medicaid consumers pay only a very small or no copay at Medicaid. So Cuban has really challenged and said, let's leverage the Medicaid system. Let's go immediately to a net price basis on everything because it's sort of in place, and use those transparent PBMs to make things work better and abandon the very large legacy PBMs that essentially control the market. So let me say a few things, though. I want to say that I am a bit of a defender of PBMs to a degree, and I wanted to make sure I get a point across here. First, I'm very upset about a slick marketing and lobbying campaign by Big Pharma that has very much put a target on PBMs' back in an effort really to divert attention from the brand drug makers. As well, I would say my own GOP party has in essence been bought and sold by Big Pharma. And so I think the singling out of PBMs as the main culprit is unfair. I do hate the PBMs' opaqueness and the ugly leverage they use in the market with spread pricing and clawbacks that hurt pharmacies, as well as regarding rebates where people are actually paying more than they really should because they're in cahoots with the brand drug makers on rebates. But I will say that PBMs do serve a good purpose in prior authorization, network quality, and other areas. Without these fairly sophisticated and knowledgeable watchdogs, drug costs would actually be even more out of control. And when it comes to the PA issue specifically, I believe that lower prices alone are not a cure for the overutilization driven by many sloppy docs and all the greedy drug makers. It could actually lead to even greater utilization. So proper and accountable prior authorization should not be a bad word in healthcare. I think it's rather important. But back to the issue of transparency, I really feel like we need to seize the initiative. I like Cuban's and other transparent PBMs' boldness. Cuban and others argue that using transparent PBMs and forcing brand drug makers to offer net prices up front would work. For sure, there are challenges in terms of speed and success. Healthcare is very much mired in acquiescence to some degree. But as I point out, the Medicare Drug Price Reform Act will help move things along. But let's not wait. It's time to try Cuban's ideas, have government further push down the road of drug price negotiations, and have committed healthcare actors embrace drug price transparency reforms, just like Blue Shield of California is doing with its radical remake of its pharmacy program for commercial products. In the end, change will be slow but sure, as I say, but Cuban and a bunch of other innovators will boldly go where no one has gone before and bring transparency and better tech to the equation. The biggest PBMs are actually mired in legacy tech, which actually holds them back. PBMs in some form and perhaps a different name will be important in my view. They will morph into value-added, tech-savvy partners within the new world. Over time, the hope is that the new PBMs may facilitate price transparency as well as provide important value add-ons in the area of PA, quality, and analytics, without all that skullduggery and chicanery in which they engage today with brand drug makers. So hats off to the transparency PBMs, and especially Mark Cuban, who is showing his leadership in terms of reform in the drug pricing space. With that, we'll conclude this week's podcast. See you next time. Take care.
Thanks for joining Mark and the Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast. Go to healthcarelabyrinth.com each day for the latest healthcare news. See you next week on the next Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast.